Many of us look at America and see how beautiful it is. From the rocky coasts of Maine to the golden shores of California, sea to shining sea. And then there is all the energy of our great cities like Dallas or New York City. This is a land of stunning natural wonder and incredible human creation. It is a place that has long captured the imagination of the world. People from every corner of the globe have dreamed of coming here, drawn by the promise of a new beginning and a better life. This idea of America as a beautiful destination, as a haven, is a powerful and enduring part of our national story. It is a story we tell ourselves and a story we tell to others. But the beauty of America is not just skin deep. It is found in the ideals that gave birth to our nation nearly 250 years ago. Ideals like liberty, equality, and the right of the people to govern themselves. These were radical ideas in their time, and in many ways they still are. They form the foundation of our republic, a grand experiment in democracy that continues to unfold. This experiment has inspired countless people to strive for something more, to believe that their lives can be improved and that their children's future can be brighter. It is our founding principles that gives our nation its true strength and its lasting appeal. Yet, we know that this beautiful land has a complicated past. The story of how we got here is not a simple one. It is a story filled with moments of courage and moments of heartbreaking cruelty. To truly understand America, we must be willing to look at all of it, not just pick and choose. We need to take the good with the bad. This story is a promise to tell the truth about this awesome country. We're going to talk about the things that make us proud, the moments when America lived up to its highest ideals. But we will also talk about the times when we didn't live up to our highest ideals. We will explore the difficult beginnings, including the devastation of the Native American people who had lived on this continent for centuries. Their story is not a footnote to American history. It is a central part of it. We will also confront the original sin of slavery. We will look at the towering figure of Abraham Lincoln and the long, difficult struggle to end slavery and begin the work of making freedom real for everyone. Our journey will then turn to the long march for equality and the right to participate in our democracy. For much of our history, the ballot box was closed to millions of Americans. Women fought for generations to win the right to vote. Black people, even after the end of slavery, faced violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws designed to keep them from voting. But they kept voting. By 1875, 11 African Americans had served in the United States Congress. Their victories expanded the meaning of we the people and made our democracy stronger and more just. Ultimately, this is a story of hope. It is a story that shows that despite our flaws and our failures, America has a remarkable capacity for change and self-correction. I hope America continues to be, in the words of so many, a shining light and a beacon of hope for the world. Our story begins with a ship crossing a vast ocean. The Mayflower was a smaller wooden boat about the size of a high school basketball court that was carrying 132 people filled with fear and hope. They were leaving behind the old world of Europe, a place of kings and rigid social classes seeking something different. Some sought religious freedom, a place where they could worship without persecution. The king was forcing his corrupt religion on the people. Others were drawn by the promise of land and economic opportunity, a chance to build a life that was impossible back home. About a 60-40 split with 60% for economic reasons. Their arrival on the shores of North America marked the start of a profound transformation, not just for them, but for the continent itself and for the course of human history. The first settlements were fragile footholds in a wilderness that was both abundant and unforgiving. Places like Jamestown and Plymouth were experiments in survival, where colonists faced starvation, disease, and conflict. Over time, these scattered outposts grew into 13 distinct colonies, each with its own character and culture, stretching along the Atlantic coast. They created local assemblies where colonists could have a voice in their own affairs, a taste of self-rule that was rare in the 18th century world. the British government began to impose new taxes and regulations on the colonies without their consent. Acts like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act were seen as a violation of a fundamental right. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed from Boston to Charleston. It was a declaration that these colonists saw themselves as free people, not merely as subjects to be commanded. The tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain finally reached a breaking point. The first shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775 were the sounds of a family argument turning into a war for independence. They were a collection of farmers, merchants, and artisans loosely united against a global empire. Yet, they were driven by a powerful conviction that their freedom was worth fighting for. In the summer of 1776, a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson was tasked with drafting a document that would explain to the world why they were taking such a radical step. The result was the Declaration of Independence. It was more than a list of grievances against a king. It was a profound statement of human rights and the purpose of government. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were revolutionary, echoing across the globe and through the ages. The war was no longer just about taxes, it was about the very idea of self-government. After a long and difficult war, with crucial help from allies like France, the improbable happened. America won. Independence was secured. They gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the Constitution of the United States, a document designed to create a government strong enough to last, but with its powers limited to protect the liberty they had just fought so hard to win. The Constitution established a republic where the people hold the power. To prevent any one person or group from becoming too powerful, the framers divided the government into three separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. A sense of national identity emerged, forged in revolution and written into law. People started to see themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans. This new nation quickly began to grow. Westward expansion became a defining feature of early American life. However, the liberty and opportunity of this new nation were not extended to everyone. The institution of slavery was deeply entrenched. Native American peoples were systematically pushed off their ancestral lands, and women were denied basic rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. Before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, the land we now call America was already home to millions of people. This was not an empty wilderness, but a continent teeming with vibrant and complex societies. Hundreds of distinct nations flourished from coast to coast, with their own languages, governments, and traditions. They were people like the Haudenosaunee in the Northeast, who formed a sophisticated political confederacy. The Mississippian cultures of the Southeast built great cities with massive earthen mounds. In the Southwest, nations like the Pueblo peoples developed intricate irrigation systems to farm the arid land, building remarkable stone dwellings that still stand today. These native nations had deep connections to the land, connections that were woven into the fabric of their spiritual and daily lives. Their economies were based on a profound understanding of their local environments, hunting buffalo on the Great Plains, fishing for salmon in the Pacific Northwest. They had complex systems of trade that crisscrossed the continent, exchanging goods, ideas, and stories. They were artists, astronomers, philosophers, and farmers. The story of America does not begin in 1492 or 1776. It begins thousands of years earlier with these first people. The arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of a cataclysmic change. The newcomers brought with them not just different technologies and beliefs, but also diseases to which the native peoples had no immunity: smallpox, measles, and influenza. Entire communities were wiped out and populations plummeted in what has been called the greatest demographic disaster in human history. This immense loss of life shattered societies, erasing centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition. In the early years of contact, the relationship between Europeans and Native Americans was complex. There were moments of cooperation, trade, and even alliance. Native peoples often taught the struggling colonists how to survive. Many of the foods we think of as quintessentially American, like corn, beans, and squash, were first cultivated by native farmers. As the United States was born and began to grow, a dark shadow fell across native lands. The new nation's relentless push westward was driven by a belief in manifest destiny, the idea that America was divinely ordained to expand across the continent. This ambition, while fueling the dreams of many settlers, meant disaster for the native nations who stood in the path of progress. The American dream for some became a nightmare for others. This policy of removal reached its tragic peak in the 1830s under President Andrew Jackson. The Indian Removal Act authorized the federal government to force tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homes in the Southeast. Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole were marched hundreds of miles west to a designated Indian territory, which is now Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way from disease, starvation, and exposure. This horrific journey became known as the Trail of Tears. It was a state-sponsored act of ethnic cleansing, a brutal chapter that laid bare the deep contradiction between America's ideals of freedom and its actions toward native peoples. Being forced from their ancestral lands was a profound spiritual and cultural wound. The places where their ancestors were buried, the sacred sites where they held their ceremonies, all were left behind. From the very beginning, these legal agreements recognized the tribes as distinct political entities, as nations with their own sovereignty. Hundreds of treaties were signed. But the history of these treaties is a history of broken promises. Time and time again, settlers and prospectors pushed further west, and the boundaries established by the treaties were ignored. The hunger for land and resources proved more powerful than the rule of law. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota is a stark example of this betrayal. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had explicitly guaranteed the Black Hills would be part of the Great Sioux Reservation, closed to all white settlement forever. But a few years later, gold was found, and thousands of miners swarmed into the area illegally. The United States government, instead of upholding the treaty, tried to force the Lakota to sell the land. When they refused, the government declared them hostile. Faced with the loss of their lands, native peoples did not simply vanish, they resisted. Warriors and leaders like Tecumseh, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo led fierce campaigns to defend their people and their territory. They fought with incredible courage and skill, often against overwhelming odds. By the end of the 19th century, the armed resistance had been crushed. The last of the Indian Wars ended with the horrific massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Native peoples were confined to reservations, their populations at an all-time low. But they survived. Today, the story is far from over. But there is also a story of incredible resilience and cultural renewal. Native nations are vibrant, self-governing communities working to strengthen their economies, revitalize their languages, and care for their people. The truth of this history is a painful but necessary part of the American story. Acknowledging what happened in the past is necessary for healing and ensuring that it never happens again. From the very beginning of the American story, there was a deep and terrible contradiction. A nation conceived in liberty was also a nation built, in part, on the brutal institution of slavery. While the founders declared that all men were created equal, millions of people were brought to America in chains and held in bondage. This practice was not a minor detail or a regional peculiarity. It was central to the economic and social fabric of the country, especially in the South. The wealth of the southern states was built on the forced, unpaid labor of enslaved African Americans. Slavery was a system of unimaginable cruelty. Human beings were treated as property, to be bought and sold like livestock. Families were torn apart on the auction block, never to see each other again. Yet within this horrific system, enslaved people found ways to resist. They preserved their humanity through family, through faith, through culture. They created a rich and vibrant spiritual life, and they resisted their bondage through acts both small and large, from slowing down work to daring escapes to freedom. As the 19th century progressed, the division between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South grew deeper and more bitter. The nation was expanding westward, and with every new territory, the question of slavery had to be confronted. The moral and political issues over slavery were like a poison. The House was divided against itself, and that never works out. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the spark that finally ignited the flames of war. Lincoln and his new Republican Party were opposed to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories no matter what. Before Lincoln could even take office, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed quickly by 10 other slave states. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, dedicated to the preservation of slavery. The Union was broken. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April 1861, the time for compromise was over. The Civil War had begun. It would become the bloodiest conflict in American history, a brutal 4-year struggle that pitted brother against brother and tested the very soul of the nation. Over 600,000 soldiers lost their lives. The beautiful fields and valleys of America became horrific battlegrounds, from the rolling hills of Gettysburg to the bloody fields of Antietam. The sacrifices of the soldiers on the battlefield demanded a higher purpose, a new birth of freedom, as he would later say at Gettysburg. The conflict was no longer just about preserving the Union as it was. It was becoming a war to create a new Union, a nation truly dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln took a monumental step. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation also opened the door for African American men to enlist in the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors fought bravely for the Union. They faced discrimination within their own ranks and the threat of execution if captured. Yet they fought with tremendous courage, proving their patriotism and their right to citizenship on the battlefield. In April 1865, the war finally ended with the surrender of the Confederacy. The Union was preserved. Congress passed and the states ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. The institution that had plagued the nation since its birth was finally destroyed. It was a moment of profound triumph, the culmination of a long and bloody struggle. The promise of freedom, so long denied, was at last written into the nation's fundamental law. But legal freedom was just the beginning of a much longer journey. The Civil War had ended slavery, but the battle for the soul of America was far from over. The words, "We the people," in the Constitution still did not include everyone. In the aftermath of the war, the 15th Amendment was passed, declaring that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For a brief, hopeful period during Reconstruction, African American men voted in large numbers, electing their own to local, state, and federal office. Yet this promise was tragically short-lived. A fierce and violent resistance arose to crush this newfound freedom. In the South, Jim Crow took hold. State governments passed a web of discriminatory laws, poll taxes, literacy tests. The vote was systematically stolen. The promise of equality was betrayed, and a long, dark night of segregation and injustice descended upon the South. At the same time, another vast group of Americans was also shut out of the democratic process. From the nation's founding, women were denied the right to vote. They were citizens in name, but had no voice in the laws that governed their lives. A powerful and persistent movement was growing to challenge this injustice. The fight for women's suffrage would become one of the longest and most difficult reform movements in American history, a marathon that lasted for over 70 years. These women organized, wrote, and agitated for the right to vote. They held conventions, published newspapers, traveled the country giving speeches, often facing ridicule and hostility. More militant activists like Alice Paul took the fight directly to Washington, D.C. They organized massive parades, picketed the White House, holding silent vigils with banners that questioned how a nation fighting for democracy abroad could deny it to its women at home. These brave women were arrested, jailed, and even went on hunger strikes. Their suffering drawing national attention to their cause and increasing public pressure for change. Meanwhile, the struggle for black voting rights in the South, entered a new and powerful phase in the mid-20th century. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. advocated a strategy of nonviolent direct action to expose the injustice of segregation and voter suppression to the nation and the world. The climax of this struggle came in places like Selma, Alabama, in 1965. Peaceful marchers attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to demand their voting rights were brutally attacked by state troopers. The shocking images of this bloody Sunday were broadcast across the country. It was brutal. It became impossible to ignore the violent reality of voter suppression. The courage of the marchers in the face of such hatred forced the hand of the federal government. The tireless efforts of the women's suffrage movement finally paid off. After decades of struggle, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, and it was ratified in 1920. With those words, the single largest extension of democratic rights in American history was achieved. Millions of women were now able to participate in the political process, forever changing the American electorate and the nation's political landscape. It was a monumental victory, a triumph, and a huge step in the journey toward a more perfect union. In response to the events in Selma, President Lyndon B. Johnson urged Congress to pass a strong voting rights bill. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the result. This was one of the most effective pieces of civil rights legislation ever enacted. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Within a few years, millions of African Americans in the South were registered to vote, and the number of black elected officials skyrocketed. The 19th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act fundamentally reshaped American democracy, making the promise of we the people more real and more inclusive than ever before. As we stand on the threshold of America's 250th anniversary, we have journeyed through the story of our nation. It is a story marked by both breathtaking triumphs and profound, painful trials. We have seen how a republic was born from a revolutionary idea, that ordinary people could govern themselves, guided by the principles of liberty and equality. This was the noble aim, the promise that has drawn people to our shores for centuries. It is the story of a constitution that created a durable framework for self-rule and a nation that grew from a small string of colonies into a continental power. This is our America. Yet we have also faced the hard truths that are woven into this same story. We have acknowledged that this nation was built on lands taken from native people, whose vibrant civilizations died because of our expansion. We have confronted the brutal contradiction of slavery, an institution of human bondage that coexisted with our rhetoric of freedom, which could only have ended in war. We have seen how, even after that war, the promise of equality remained unfulfilled for millions, women and African Americans, who had to wage long, arduous struggles to claim their most fundamental right as citizens, the right to vote. Not good. To love America is to hold both of these truths at the same time, but not to solely focus on our past mistakes. We need to keep looking forward. The abolitionists who fought slavery, the suffragists who demanded the vote, the civil rights marchers who faced down hate, they were not enemies of America. They were patriots, calling on the nation to be better. After nearly 250 years, America still offers the world a model of self-rule and renewal, because in generations before us, people cared to make it better. The work of perfecting our union is part of being American. This is the story of us. The task remains the same, ensuring that our government remains of the people, by the people, and for the people. So as we commemorate this milestone, let us remember our whole story, to engage with one another peacefully and love our country even though we're not perfect. The future of the Republic is not guaranteed. Ronald Reagan said it best, freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. Let's teach our children our history so they can know. By doing so, we can ensure that America, on its 250th birthday and for centuries to come, continues to be a beacon of hope and a shining city on a hill. Happy 250th birthday, America. Oh, and don't forget, it's always time to travel.